Video today on the Weekly Standard and specifically a dissect a tweet that Trump issued over the weekend about Bill Kristol's prediction record. So on Saturday after news broke that the Weekly Standard was going bankrupt and would shut down, President Trump tweeted about the Weekly Standard. He said, quote, "The pathetic and dishonest Weekly Standard, run by failed prognosticator Bill Kristol, who, like many others, never had a clue, is flat broke and out of business. Too bad, may it rest in peace." Now, the part here that I found quite interesting was that he labeled Bill Kristol a failed prognosticator. And it's obviously funny in a sense coming from a guy who predicted that Mexico would pay for our border wall to be criticizing his political opponent for, among all things, being a failed prognosticator. But there actually is a serious point here that I want to talk about. Now, I began to think about Bill Kristol and his prediction record a long time ago. As many of you know, I used to be a pretty true-believing neoconservative, and so I always, beginning in high school, really followed Bill Kristol, looked at his analysis and prediction. I also got to know him a little bit, and was and continue to be quite fond of him and admire his work as a political operative. And I think that as this Trump phenomenon unfolds, I think Kristol, for all his shortcomings, will be seen as a rare, principled voice who tried to stand up against Donald Trump. But nevertheless, I think it has to be conceded that Bill Kristol's prediction record is large and generally unimpressive. I learned this the hard way. I remember during the run-up to the 2016 presidential elections, there was talk about whether or not Joe Biden was going to enter the race. I wasn't totally sure, but I was betting on this question in the prediction markets. And then Bill Kristol announced that he had very solid sources saying that Biden was in. And I placed a bet on Biden getting in. It turned out to be the wrong bet. I lost some money on it. And then I began to look into Kristol's prediction record more generally. And you can Google it. Just Google Bill Kristol prediction record or whatever. And you see just a litany of very detailed, very specific, and just utterly incorrect predictions. Now, the interesting thing though about Bill Kristol and his prediction record is that his prediction record is bad, but it's by no means unique among people who are out there in the political arena, always on TV, always offering their punditry. In fact, I would argue that the only thing that is remarkable about Bill Kristol's prediction record is the fact that he, unlike the vast majority of his peers, actually has been called out for it. So, for example, like I discussed this at length in my ebook, How to Make Money from Political Predictions, which I link to here. But to give you an idea, I mean, just a recent example, in Politico, Stephen Voss did a profile of Bill Kristol, which was actually on balance sympathetic. But nevertheless, he made note of, in talking about Bill Kristol, he makes note of, quote, his consistently, publicly, multiple online compilations of his worst predictions wrong. That's how he described Bill Kristol's prediction record. And it's gotten so bad that Ali Velshi, of MSNBC, recently had Bill Kristol on his show, and he in passing, just to be polite and nice, he said, Kristol makes many predictions that are often true. And even Bill Kristol sheepishly replied, well, sometimes not. So, even Kristol's sort of in on the joke. Now, the question that I want to talk about, though, is, why is it that in the vast majority of cases, particularly our political pundits, why are they so often wrong in their predictions? And then why is there generally no real account for it? I mean, insofar as the Weekly Standard is folding, in part because of its inability to forecast and predict things properly, it's a distinct exception. I mean, you can look at any of these major publications. I mean, whether or not they're mainstream, whether or not they have an opinion or editorial line, I mean, you can just document their predictions and their opinions, their forecasts are just flat wrong. So I talk about that in my ebook, and I want to talk about that here. The question that I want to tackle is, why is mainstream media, mainstream political punditry, why is it so indifferent to people's forecasting accuracy? And I think, so I'll go through a few reasons here. I think one big thing is that there remains just a general ignorance of the fact that forecasting actually is a skill, is a practice that can be learned and improved, and it's something that can be done. So it really wasn't until the late 70s that a substantial body of academic research on election forecasting even began to accumulate. And this literature is very, very slowly making its way into our day-to-day discourse, in large part due to people like Nate Silver, who have very effectively offered models and made election forecasting a game and something that people follow the way they do sports betting and other sorts of things. And so, for that reason, even very influential political scientists continue to dismiss election forecasting as being beyond the bounds of scientific study, and so forth. And because there's a great deal of ignorance about election forecasting and prediction, what you end up seeing among very influential people is that when it comes to prediction, they often embrace either wild optimism or undue pessimism. So on the one extreme are people who exemplify what Wharton professor Scott Armstrong called, quote, the seersucker theory. And he basically says, no matter how much evidence exists that seers do not exist, suckers will pay for the existence of seers. So in other words, what Armstrong's saying is that there are not people who can actually predict things, but regardless of that, there is a demand for people who presumably can predict things, and therefore they get paid for it. Rajir Sharma also talks about this in his book, Breakout Nations, which is about emerging markets. It's a terrific read, actually. But he sort of talks sarcastically about this. He says that the new rule, as he calls it, of forecasting, the staple argument that companies, politicians, high-profile public intellectuals do, they forecast so far into the future that no one will know if you got it wrong. And he says that these very long-term forecasts or views are become emphatically influential. And then on the other end, though, are people who basically say that prediction is totally futile. It can't be done. They don't even bother. So even like the Economist in a 2007 piece, it's called, the title is The Future of Futurology. The Economist, which is obviously a respectable, serious publication, they ask rhetorically, when the best scientists in the field say openly that they can only guess at the long-term effects, how can a futurologist do better? So there's a certain fatalism that basically political risk is very difficult to do. It's not even worth doing. Now, I have a different view on prediction. I think that on the one hand, it's in fact not futile to try to predict things. I think that there is a methodology, a science to it. There are a lot of different indicators, ways of thinking that can consistently improve your ability to forecast and predict things. But the problem is that many of these practices and the people who are good at it are not the people who tend to be influential in our political discourse. People like Bill Kristol and people at the Weekly Standard. So why is that? And I think a big factor here is the fact that political predictions in particular are often made in a context where stakeholders have incentives that not only do not encourage good predictions, but in fact, I would argue, actively discourage accountability in forecasting. So, one reason is that occasionally political media has tried to look at people's prediction records and forecasts, but what they found in the ratings is that the viewers actually give higher ratings to people who offer bold but erroneous forecasts. So if you go on TV, you give a bold prediction or forecast, even if you're wrong, you end up generating more media coverage. And Wharton professor Philip Tiplock, who's probably the leading researcher in this area, has found that forecasters who are most likely to be recruited by the media actually have a worse prediction record than their lower profile colleagues. And then basically and this is because media consumption tends to reward kind of distinct, sharp, witty commentary that that basically has no actual bearing to reality. So economist Robert Hanson talks about this. He says, and I'm quoting now, media consumers can be educated and entertained by clever, witty, but accessible commentary, and can coordinate to signal they are smart and well-read by quoting and discussing the words of the same few focal pundits. Also, impressive pundits with prestigious credentials and clear philosophical positions can let readers and viewers gain affiliation with such impressiveness, credentials, and positions. Being easier to understand and classify helps hedgehogs. Hedgehogs are the people who deliver big, bold predictions to serve many of these functions. And this is something that people who often have bad prediction records, sometimes they're actually even quite honest when it comes to this. So, a rare person, sort of like Bill Kristol, who continuously is brought on TV and whatnot for his predictions, even when they're proven over and over again to be wrong. One of these people is Dick Morris, the former Clinton advisor. Now, he's obviously an incredibly intelligent practitioner of American politics. He helped get Bill Clinton elected and through a tough time in his presidency. So I think he certainly can't be dismissed as being dumb. And yet he was named by Pundit Tracker to be the worst pundit, literally the worst pundit when it came to his faulty prediction record. And after years of just giving bad predictions, it finally caught up to Morris when he repeated over and over again on Fox News that Mitt Romney would not only win the election against Obama, but that he would do so in a landslide. And so Sean Hannity invited him on after the election. And then Dick Morris basically came clean about what was going on. So this is what he said. I'm quoting here. Sean, I hope people aren't mad at me about it. I spoke about what I believed, and I think that there was a period of time when the Romney campaign was falling apart. People were not optimistic. Nobody thought there was a chance of victory. And here's the key now. And I felt that it was my duty at that point to go out and say what I did. So in other words, he's saying, look, I mean, he's subtly conceding here. He knew that what he was saying was probably bullshit, but he knew that by offering a good prediction, that would help his. It was what the viewers wanted to hear and needed to hear, and that it would inject optimism into the Romney campaign. Now, I have to say that you can't really blame pundits for doing this when this is what the media wants. And I mean, it's very, very rare that anyone's prediction record, Bill Kristol and Morris notwithstanding, actually is litigated. And so and when it is litigated, often it's not done in the spirit of actually wanting to figure out like which pundits actually know what they're talking about, who actually has a good record. And so like an example here I can give you, I'm sure many of you guys saw this on Tucker Carlson's show recently. He had Tucker invited Council on Foreign Relations scholar Max Boot on for a debate, and they're both going at each other, and then finally, so Tucker Carlson, then he's now kind of going on the attack, and he calls out Matt Boot for his prediction record. So he says to Boot, to dismiss people who disagree with you as immoral, which is your habit, isn't a useful form of debate. It's kind of a moral preening, and it's a little odd coming from you, who really has been consistently wrong in the most flagrant and flamboyant way for over a decade. So now Tucker Carlson calls Max Boot out for his prediction record, and for people who are generally familiar with what's going on, it's kind of obvious what he's alluding to. What he's basically doing is calling Max Boot out for his high-profile, notable support of not only the Iraq War, but then a number of U.S. military interventions that ended up not going well. So Boot now takes the bait, and he says, what have I been wrong about, Tucker? What have I been wrong about? Then Tucker Carlson says, well, having watched you carefully and known you for a long time, I recall vividly when you said that if we were to topple the governments of Afghanistan and Iraq, the region will be much safer, and the people who took their place would help us in the global war on terror. Of course, it didn't happen. So now Boot, he doesn't try to defend his record right now. He fires back at at Tucker Carlson. He says, Tucker, you supported the invasion of Iraq. You supported the invasion of Iraq. And then Tucker Carlson goes on to litigate this, but then he basically starts taunting Max Boot. He says, maybe you should choose another profession, selling insurance, something you're good at. I guess that's kind of the point. Is there no sanctions for being as wrong as you have? Now, this is a good question that Tucker is Tucker is posing here. And then Max Boot says, well, I would be happy to hold up my record of foreign policy against yours. And then Carlson says, I'm beginning to think that your judgment has been clouded by ideology, which is undoubtedly true. I mean, Boot is, at the end of the day, he has an ideology, and I think it's fair to say that ideology has sometimes led him to judgments that are not true. Then Boot fires back. He says, Tucker, I think your judgment has been clouded by ratings because you feel compelled by Donald Trump in order to win ratings on the Fox News channel. Now, Tucker Carlson, he replies by saying, by ratings, that is pretty funny. I mean, he doesn't deny it because he can't deny it. I mean, of course, his editorial line and his predictions and so forth are influenced by what people want to hear on Fox News. Now, this debate ended up going viral, and you had very serious people weighing in. So Atlantic contributor Peter Beinart, he described it as intellectually interesting. And then Max Boot said he regretted going on the show, and a post-mortem, a lot of people talked about it. But what I found interesting was that in all the commentary that this generated, I don't know of a single person who actually bothered to go back and compare their respective prediction records. And if the academic literature is any indication, my strong suspicion is that both, if one were to look head-to-head at their prediction records, both Tucker Carlson and Max Boot probably actually have a whole litany of predictions that are just flat-out wrong. Okay, so I think this lack of accountability is a big part of it. But then the question becomes, well, why aren't people held accountable? Why isn't there more curiosity about people's prediction records? Why are we not paying more attention to this? And this isn't simply a phenomenon in politics or even in political media. It's actually the norm throughout our society. And I think a big part of it is that we're very much oriented around a society, and we reward people on the basis of training and expertise that actually is typically unrelated to forecasting skills. So if you look at who we tend to reward in our society, there are people who reach the top of the educational game, where they get degrees from elite undergraduate schools, or they go on to get masters and professional degrees and PhDs, which are, for the most part, designed to train people either in a certain academic discourse or way of thinking, or often to train people to be professionals in a certain field. But the reality is that the training which has developed over a long period of time for a variety of reasons, actually has nothing really to do with forecasting skill. And so now you have this whole technical professional elite in virtually every major sector of our economy, who, if they were actually held accountable in some way for their predictions, they would basically be opening the door to people realizing that their expertise and training, whatever it's worth, is not lending itself to good prediction, and obviously that they could jeopardize their very livelihood. And John Tierney actually sort of admitted as much in a New York Times column. He was writing about political predictions and political prediction markets, and how these markets often can come to more reliable judgments than punditry. And and then Tierney sort of says sardonically, he says, quote, "When I consider those thousands of traders working around the clock without salaries or health benefits, I hate to think that I'm starting a column just as the job is being outsourced." So in other words, now that there are people out there in prediction markets producing information, what use will I have as a political pundit? And business school professors report in surveys and so forth that firms, even the top firms in our country, are very rarely interested in conducting randomized experiments to actually assess their predictions about business methods. And why should they? So if you look, for example, in the management consulting business, these are people who basically get clients who are ostensibly paying them for their forecasts and their good predictions. But the reality is that when you really look at the market for people who are allegedly paying for good predictions, what you find is that actually it's a pretense, that what they're not paying, they're actually not paying for good forecasting accuracy. What they are paying for is someone respectable with credentials to offer a prediction, which will then allow them to avoid responsibility if things go badly. And so, I mean, even today, the vast majority of corporations and government spend little or no time or money analyzing the accuracy of forecasts, nor do they do much research to try to develop and compare forecasting methods. And then the problem is compounded by the fact that there obviously are people out there who tend to be better forecasters and predictors. But far from being people who are typically welcome into the fold, they actually are treated like sort of a buzzkill and a danger for people in power. So you think about, for example, these people who are accurate forecasters who consume information with an open mind. It has to be admitted that they assume a great deal of occupational hazard for defending analyses that contradict conventional or favored wisdom. So in academia, for example, you risk rejection and biased peer review processes, which is to say nothing about all the political biases that are in academia. Those who are political partisans, by offering a prediction that goes against their tribal or ideological or partisan interests, basically end up facing the real threat of being ostracized. I found it very funny here on the eve of the 2018 midterms. I got an email, I don't even know where it came from this political firm. It's called the District Media Group. I haven't heard of it, or I hadn't heard of it. But they were offering free advice here to people involved with the midterms, and they're saying here that this is presumably they're saying this unironically. This is their expert advice that they're offering. They're saying, quote, "If you're working on a campaign, you have to predict that your candidate will win. No matter how unlikely it seems, a victory is always the right and expected prediction." I don't know, it has to be, I mean, this is laughable, but it has to be conceded that most people actually do follow this. So I remember in the October 2006 period, just about a month, not even a month, a couple of weeks ago before the midterm elections, where it was pretty clear that the Republicans were in for a beating. President Bush went out there and he publicly predicted a Republican speaker and a Republican leader of the Senate. And not only did he say this publicly, But even internally within the White House, he went as far as to banish any talk of losing the Republican majorities. And the Washington Post later reported this was in order to squelch any loss of nerve among his legions. It's really no different in the business or corporate sector, that if you think about analysts who offer predictions that might contravene their managers' decisions, they're basically now setting themselves up to get punished, and that other people who are yes men are more likely to get promoted, because at the end of the day, the vast majority of managers, the reason why they become managers in a corporation or a bureaucracy, they're reasons that are entirely incidental to forecasting skill. I would argue, if anything, that they're usually there due to attributes that actually cut against their ability to basically offer good predictions. Now, so there are some of the people, and I'm one of these people who are interested in this issue of prediction. One of the theories that is out there is called the wisdom of the crowds. And so the idea basically is that if you have a question and you want to try to predict it, ask a bunch of random people to offer their opinion and make a bet on it, put some money in it. And then, if you have a market, then the market will come to a certain price, and that price can give you an indication of whether or not, how likely an event is to happen. Now, I talk about this in great detail in my ebook. And what we found so far is that political prediction markets, they're not perfect, and they often can err wildly, but there are at least a certain type of question where prediction markets have been found to be very, very accurate, and much more so in any case than the predictions of political pundits. And yet, political prediction markets, even today, just haven't really become a part of our mainstream discourse. And in thinking about why that is, so I can quote here Emil Servan-Schreiber. He's a prediction market pioneer. And he basically says here, quote, "The idea that a bunch of amateurs getting together could outclass the expert human mind is disconcerting, as disconcerting as saying the Earth is not the center of the solar system." And then Andrew Rice, in a profile of Intrade, this was the old prediction market that went out of business a few years ago. He said that he predicted, even though he's basically an enthusiast of political prediction markets, he raised the unsettling possibility, and then he basically predicted that prediction markets, quote, will fail because the product they deliver, accurate predictions about the future, is not a product people actually want. And then he explains the point here, and I think this was very intelligent. He says here, what motivates us to vote, opine, and prognosticate is often not the desire for efficacy or accuracy in worldly affairs, the things that prediction markets deliver, but instead the desire to send signals to each other about who we are. Humans remain intensely tribal. We choose groups to associate with, and we try hard to show everybody which groups we belong to. More than we like accuracy, we like listening to talkers on our side and identifying them as being on our own team, the right team. Okay, so this is why now political prediction markets are not popular. This is also why people like Bill Kristol and people at the Weekly Standard, no matter how many bold, erroneous predictions that they offer, for the most part, are not really called out for it. And when they are called out for it, it usually isn't in the context of actually trying to figure out if they got things wrong, why did they get it wrong, how can they be improved. It's usually when their predictions enter a political debate or a political fray, and you typically have multiple people on all sides, all of whom have terrible prediction records, all of whom are, for the most part, ignorant about how wrong their political predictions are, basically taunting each other and going back and forth. Now, okay, so this begs the question, is there a way to get to better predictions? Are there certain people who tend to be better at predicting, at forecasting. What do they do, and what can we learn from them? So I in my ebook, I did a lot of research on this, and I found a number of different. I guess my big conclusion, one, is that forecasting actually is a skill, is a talent, is an expertise that can be learned and improved, but also that some people just are naturally better at it, like anything else. So I'll run through these quickly. What are some of what's the profile of someone who's a good predictor, a good trader in the markets? So number one is a track record of strong returns from gambling or investing. There's a University of Iowa study that found that experienced investors with a high degree of financial knowledge are more likely to act as rational traders. Number two is a high IQ. A recent study of people who are very good at forecasting found that many facets of good judgment in prediction are correlated with intelligence. And there are very strong correlations between IQ and investment performance in the stock market. And in fact, a high IQ is actually even more predictive of good investing, good predictions than income level. Number three, a high education level. So people with a high education level are generally less likely to make irrational trading decisions. And if you look at specifically in the realm of politics and presidential elections, college graduates are significantly less likely to exhibit what's called preference expectation bias than those without a college degree. Preference expectation bias is basically the idea that if you want something to happen, then you also expect it to happen. Like if you have a college degree, you're usually more able to basically realize that what you want